the way we're going to do this is I'm going to speak for about 15-20 minutes using slides. And then Cheryl and I are going to have a discussion, and then we're going to open it up to you as well. So we're here to talk about the opportunities of narrative. And we're going to start with a supposition, right? A stipulation that culture and storytelling are the connective tissue that binds us together as humans. In a world that is sort of moving towards a social innovation, social enterprise, social impact world, moving towards big data, I believe that culture and storytelling have to be there to contextualize. And that's why we're here tonight to talk about it. This is a little, can you hear me? This is a little hollow, right? It's a little tinny. It's a little feedback. Is it okay?
It's okay from here.
Is it okay from the back? Can you hear me? Okay. How's that? Maybe we can turn that one off for the moment. Better? Better. Okay. Okay, great. So I work in social impact and social innovation using creative media, and I work with movements, campaigns, project and social enterprises, right? And when I think about what I can bring to the mix and what every single movement, campaign, project, and enterprise needs to be successful, it's these three things. They're not exclusive. It doesn't mean that this is the only thing that they need. But if they don't have this, if they don't have a cohesive narrative, shared goals, and a common identity, they're not going to succeed. Okay? This is the basis of using storytelling in social impact. And we'll get into this in a little bit. We're just supposing these two things, that culture and storytelling are connective tissue, and that these things, movements, campaigns, project, and enterprises, need these three things. Okay? And by the way, I'm going to put up all my slides on SlideShare and my website afterwards, so you can take notes, but you'll also have this available to you. So with those two suppositions, right, I want to talk about two things: the power of narrative and narrative power. Now it sounds like, they're the same thing. It sounds like it's a trick of words, but they're a little bit different. And this is the way I think about these two things. The power of narrative is a construct, right? It's looking at how you use narrative as a tool. It's centered in design and innovation. It's really creating a notion of entry points into social change, increasing the surface area for how people interact with your projects, and it's the notion of community engagement, making sure that people are using storytelling to engage with your projects. Narrative power is about framing. It's about political, social, and cultural power, because there are many different forms of power. And right now, I think the world is thinking a lot about financial power and political power, but I'm thinking about narrative power, about looking at how people use their own stories to get a seat at the table of decision-making tables, and how they use their own story, especially from local communities, to be a part of social change. So when you put these two together, the power of narrative and narrative power come together to set a cultural stage, to humanize issues, to cause shifts in perception, which is the only way to set a stage for social change, to create calls to action that are embedded in people's stories, and then to create measurable impact. And I have measurable in parentheses because I'm not quite sure we can measure it, but we'll talk about that a bit later as well. So as I said before, in a world moving towards big data, creative media and cultural expression have the power to contextualize human need and experience. Right? One of the things that I see in social enterprise and social innovation is we're always thinking about sort of top-down engagements, right? And we're centered in numbers and data and statistics. And even if we think it's a story, it isn't always coming from the ground. So how do we bring local stories? How do we bring community voice? How do we bring all of these things into the mix to make sure that it's much more, that you're reconciling top down and bottom up. The roots of my work are in design, transmedia storytelling, I'll say what the word transmedia means in a second, and social innovation. That's where I do my work, right? So they're coming in from things like the notion of community-centeredness, local voice and humanization of issues, and then social innovation, which is this definition. You're at the center for social innovation. I'm hoping that you know what social innovation means, but that's the definition that I usually work with. But these are the three things that I set my stage with, right, when I'm using creative media. Now, transmedia storytelling. How many people have heard the word transmedia? Okay, great. So a few people have it. Transmedia is a design construct as well. It's a process by which you take a core story and extend it over a number of different platforms, again, to increase your entry points into a project. Okay, and I'm looking at transmedia for social change, transmedia activism. Okay, and it's a framework for strategy to create social impact, influence perception, build community through this notion of extending through fragmented storytelling with a number of different authors who create entry points into a project. Now, why is this important? Why are these things like design, social innovation, transmedia storytelling, transmedia for social change, why is it important? It goes back to what I just said. It's about the ability to tell stories together. Right? So the power of narrative, right, and narrative power are coming back to the ability to reconcile top down and bottom up through storytelling. Okay. It's also how you can tell the story of complexity. If you're extending your story over a number of different platforms and looking at stories from a number of different authors, it's a lot easier to tell a complex story or the story of an ecosystem. And finally, it's a way to tell a story that is based either in reality or imagination, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. But it's always based on the stories of individuals. It's based, again, on human experience. So the way you think about constructing narrative platforms in social impact, right? Why is this important again? It's because it is enhanced engagement, right? So often what we'll do is we'll look at a jump from awareness to impact, right? If you're thinking about an issue, if you're looking at any particular, I'm going to get into case studies in a second, this is all to set the stage. But if you're thinking about the way we construct stories, or the way we construct media, or even our business plans, business models, we're looking at here's a problem, here's a solution, and let's leap. But you need to engage people, right? You need to engage people, get them to commit to a certain action that will then lead them to change. And you do that through audience building, community engagement, and using actionable stories and building a story, quote-unquote, universe. Okay, so a story universe is, again, it's an aligned theme with transmedia storytelling, which means a constellation or an ecosystem of stories that tell a story of your system. So in terms of building community, right, again, you're going back to these same things, story, collaborative action, and voice, when you're going to be engaging communities. And the way I think about the way you build communities using narrative design is you think about there's sort of these aligned thoughts. And Cheryl, you and I can talk about this a little bit more, because this is a little obscure, it's a little abstract, but we can talk about this a little bit more. But you think about it in terms of how you get people to, if you lead them to action, you think about things like choreography, or symphony, or a team sport. Like that, those are analogies for me for how you put together a narrative platform, like how you create opportunities out of story for social change. So now let's talk a little bit about the work that I do. I run a collective of designers and storytellers in New York City. It's a social innovation strategy consultancy. And I work with people all around the world. So I started thinking about the power of storytelling through these two projects. I was on your left, is a movie called Born into Brothels, which won the Academy Award in 2005. It's a documentary about children of sex workers in Calcutta. And their work with a photographer, they learn how to create their own photographs and sort of think about their world differently. It's a different form of self-expression, right? And they were able to, through their photography classes and through their expressions, get a new sort of view on life. I was the executive director of the nonprofit, and it was the first time that I had seen, I'm a sort of a recovering attorney, and left the law because I was so bored of it, and it wasn't sort of calling my social justice, calling anything to do with my social justice desires. So I ended up becoming the executive director of a couple of different nonprofits. One of them was Kids with Cameras. And I had always wanted to combine human rights and social justice with creative media, with storytelling, with culture, and I didn't quite know how to do it. And then all of a sudden this project fell into my lap. And it was the power of the stories of the children was immense. I mean, immense. We were getting so much attention and people wanted to help and people wanted to build solutions with us. The film, we extended it over, it was a very rudimentary sort of narrative design platform, very rudimentary cross-media platform. But we had a website, we had the photographs of the children that were in a touring exhibit. They were being sold for an educational fund for the children themselves. So we were able to do that, and that was 2005. 8 years later, there's a home and a school being constructed in Calcutta for the same neighborhood of children, and the children themselves have, in the movie, have, you know, sort of all these different sort of success stories and not so successful stories, which I can share with you later. The second one was something called Devil Came on Horseback, which is another documentary film on the genocide in Darfur. And again, it was a sort of this rudiment. This is all pre-social media, all pre-Facebook, Twitter, you know, all sort of digital tools. But this one was about the genocide in Darfur, as I said, so again, a sort of rudimentary cross-media platform. But again, it's extremely powerful as part of the Save Darfur movement. And so these two projects came back to back, and it just sort of put me on the path of understanding, at least in visual media and in moving image, what the power was to engage people towards discussion and solutions. Another project that I worked on is called Innocente. This just won the Academy Award this year. And I don't mean to name drop, but it was kind of nice that it also won the Oscar. But this one is this was a single platform narrative design and social impact project. It's a short documentary about child homelessness and of an undocumented teenager and her sort of new lease on life because she becomes an artist, and she's an amazing artist. You should check out her stuff. So that was another project that was really about the power of visual art and storytelling in shifting her life. She now she's selling her own art. It's pretty amazing, and also in creating a new to the question of child homelessness. And this project, it's called Who is Diane Cristal? This is probably the biggest project I'm working on right now, and it's a massive transmedia project and social impact project. This is a film, it opened Sundance this year, in 2013. It's coming out in theaters, it's a full-length documentary coming out in theaters in April. And it has a number of different transmedia elements, a number of different narrative elements. I'm going to show you two little clips from the past, from before the film came about, and then a clip from the film. Let me see if I can do this. It's not my computer. Hold on a second. So let me just set the stage. So The Invisibles is this is a trailer of 4 short films. The actor Gael Garcia Bernal, who's from Mexico, worked with my business partner in this, Mark Silver, to do 4 short films for Amnesty International about the journey that Central Americans take through Mexico in the hopes of reaching the US-Mexico border. Now, I started working with Mark Silver 4 years ago on the question of borders and the question of using stories and sourcing stories to figure out what people think about created borders, whether they're man-made, financial, psychological, whatever. It was called the Resist Network, sort of pre-Occupy. And out of those stories came the story for Who is Diane Cristal, out of that platform also came the idea for these stories. Amnesty International reached out to Gael and Mark and said, could you please work with on these 4 stories to talk about migration? I'm going to show you the trailer for that.
Es gente que tiene una meta muy clara, pero que siento que si nosotros estuviéramos en esa situación, siento que hubiéramos renunciado hace rato. Me contagio de su fuerza y de sus ganas de seguir adelante.
Algunos que van de sus países porque quieren encontrar un mejor futuro, pero en vez de encontrar un mejor futuro encuentra uno cosas que no espera uno encontrar.
Que me dio la impresión de que como un animalito lo hubieran jalado con ese alambre y lo fueron a meter ahí como cualquier perro.
Lo sacas, lo hacen pedazos y luego en un tambo de 200 litros de diésel lo ponen a calentar y ahí lo meten.
Y me dicen, máteme, déjeme que me desangre. Y le ponen una cubeta en el hospital y le ponen las 2 piernitas que escurrieran ahí. Y no, le digo, no, se va a morir, se va a desangrar. Entonces yo vengo y la subo y me dice, deje que me desangre, deje que me muera.
Sorry, I should have warned you about the graphic nature of that. So the film, the 4 shorts are about the journey. Right? They're about the journey that people take. The film, the full length with Danny Cristal is about what happens when they make it over the U.S.-Mexico border or don't, and it's about deaths on the border. And the film details the one man's life and death. No, it's not named Diana Cristal. You have to watch the movie to see who Diana Cristal is. But it's one man who's found on our side of the border, on the U.S. side of the border in Arizona. Most undocumented migrants who make the journey are not identifiable. They're not carrying identification. They don't have dental records to tie them to. There are massive database problems. And the film sort of recounts what happens in terms of repatriation, identification, repatriation. It also talks about it, the film traces back the family of the man who was found down to Central America. And then it also talks about the journey, right? So from these 4 short films, there's another part of the documentary that talks about the journey, and Gael takes the same journey that the man took. Right, the same journey that these people have taken in these 4 short films. I'm just going to show you a clip of that.
A unos kilómetros de la frontera, entre Sonora y Arizona, hay un pueblo llamado Altar. Altar, el lugar donde se hace la última ofrenda antes de cruzar el desierto. Si has logrado alcanzar este punto del camino, la tierra prometida está a la vista. Pero siempre los últimos pasos son los más difíciles. Del otro lado del muro se encuentran los Estados Unidos, el condado de Lina, Arizona.
So I need to find my presentation again. There it is. So the film is going to have a take action and education website. It's going to have a number of different digital assets. We've been sort of spending the last 3 or 4 years building all of our social action components, digital, real world, and also sort of digging in deeply into the question of migration and really thinking about the ecosystem of issues that migrants are caught in, right? So what we're looking at is not just the border, but we're looking at what happens from point of origin all the way to the US responsibility on this issue, right? So we're sort of crafting this, a narrative over the narrative of the films and using different assets to sort of get people in to the issues and education and direct action, right? So that's a full thing. And you can take a look at, there's an op-doc. Do you guys know what the New York Times op-docs are? Have you heard of this? So the New York Times has been, and I'll show you 2 projects that the New York Times has done. The New York Times is doing a really pretty amazing job on their interactive content. They're really doing some groundbreaking work. One of the things that they've done is the New York Times op-docs project, which is working with documentary filmmakers who they find through Sundance and through Just Films from Ford Foundation, just a sort of group of documentary filmmakers who are breaking ground in their own ways. And they're doing editorial op-eds, but in documentary form. And they now have over, I think, about 80 of them on just a range of issues. It's pretty amazing. So take a look. So Mark Silver, the director of, who is Diane Cristal in The Invisibles, also did one called Bodies on the Border, which is another take on the narrative. Again, so it's always stretching the narrative into many different ways just to make sure that we're always hitting issues, we're always hitting different audiences. So the New York Times op-doc was viewed however many times and stimulated discussion, and then we got it onto Upworthy, which increased, just augmented the audience again. And some of the comments were actually really dismaying, but some of them were like, you know what, I've never thought about it this way. Like, I didn't realize that this was happening, and I'm going to change my vote, or I'm going to look at this differently. And that's when you know you sort of hit someone, you hit a chord. I also do, we can talk about this later, Cheryl, if you want to. Okay, great, because, so I don't only work with films when it comes to designing narrative platforms. I also work with institutions. So I've done work with the World Bank and UNICEF. It's really about getting them to think differently about how they use narrative and how they use local storytelling in their projects, right? And how they can sort of look at 21st century innovations in either new media, social media, transmedia, but also in co-creation and collaboration in storytelling. Right? So that's the work that I did with both of them. And strangely enough, they were like sponges, right? Not that that's strange, but really trying to figure out how they can look at narrative as a driver of change, not just as a communications element, but actually as a programmatic driver, right, of the way they construct their programs, making sure that local voices are part of program design. And I do this work also with nonprofit organizations, right? So it's not just institutional, it's not just sort of ninja DIY filmmakers, it's also nonprofit. So there's one called 3 Generations that I'd love for you to take a look at. It's an organization that looks at genocide, mass atrocity, and crimes against humanity through the lens of storytelling, making sure that survivors are telling their stories and looking at patterns in that way. Just working right now with the Caucus for Children's Rights in Tanzania. Like they're looking for grassroots storytelling to be a mobilizing element and to bring those stories to ministries and the government and make sure that there is decision-making based in local storytelling. And then Internews, and I can't talk about that too much, but just take a look at that organization. They're a news media organization thinking about co-creation in a really interesting way. I'm working with their Center for Innovation and Learning. And they're looking at transmedia and narrative design as a means for co-creation. And then here's some projects that you can take a look. They're not done yet. These are forthcoming. So again, there's different ways of looking at things. There's one called Shiva Destroy Sex, which is going to be an augmented reality project looking at changing perceptions on sexual violence in India. There's another one called Laku Music, which is in Haiti, and it's capacity building distribution channels for Haitian musicians. Right, so it's again grounded in local storytelling, but allowing, it's almost like a Buena Vista Social Club for Haiti, but using new media and transmedia. And the last one is something called Traveling While Black, which is in pre-production. But again, it's going to be a sort of this massive transmedia platform thinking about the idea of African American travel in this country. Let's look at, really quickly, a couple of other people's projects, you know, sort of like looking at projects and notes, people who are setting a cultural stage for change using narrative platforms. So here are four that I just really, really love. One is called Dadaab Stories. It's about the Dadaab refugee camp, which is the largest refugee camp in the world. And that is, it's not a direct action platform, it's not necessarily about social change in that activist sense, but it's basically creating a platform for people who live in the refugee camp to tell their own stories. And it's really beautifully organized, sort of by issue, by type of audience. It's really pretty amazing. Another one's called What's Sandy Storyline. And this is stories from Staten Island, Queens, you know, pretty much, it's not Sandy in the Caribbean, but it's Sandy here. People who are still dispossessed of their homes, right? It's been sort of this year-long project of trying to get people to tell their stories, to sort of think about how we think about environmental sustainability, disaster, and resilience. Another one's called Hollow. This is pretty amazing. This one is set in West Virginia, and it's an interactive web doc. That's stories from the ground in West Virginia, from this one town that's basically lost all its jobs. There are no jobs right now because of the manufacturing, basically brain drain and corporate drain. But it's really, again, setting that stage for people to tell their stories and think about a different way of bringing in economic resilience and just sort of cultural identity, just really expressing pride and cultural identity. And then the last one is something called My Sky is Falling. This is a little more activist than the other three. But this is a platform for children, and they've basically designed with the designer. They're youth and young, sort of like 14 to 18, people who are aging out of the foster care system in primarily the Northeast, but around the country, and what challenges they face. And again, using storytelling, their own stories, to think about how we construct our systems. What's the cost of, the human cost of our policies? And then you can take a look. These are sort of more in the journalistic sense. There's on the upper left is this really fascinating project. It's from a data visualization company called Out of Sight, Out of Mind, and it's about drone strikes and the victims of drone strikes. And you can see it visualized. Maybe during the Q&A I can see if I can pull it up and find it. It's just fascinating the way they've sort of constructed this. Snowfall. This one is from the New York Times. Has anybody sort of experienced snowfall or gone through that? I really encourage you guys to go through it. It's pretty amazing the way they've constructed this notion of being in the middle of an avalanche, right? So it's not exactly an activist or social impact thing, but it's really pretty amazing. And then The Guardian in November released their interactive. Somebody on Twitter said The Guardian got snowfalled, because Snowfall was the first big interactive design journalistic project, and then The Guardian sort of followed this, and we're really talking about the revelations from the NSA files. And this is an amazing piece of journalism. Spend some time with this as well. And then just today, I haven't read this yet. It literally just came out today. It's called Invisible Child. It's a 5-chapter interactive, really data and story-rich report from the New York Times. And I can't judge it on substance or content because I haven't read it, but in terms of form, it's amazing. Again, this is in journalism, so it's not activist, and the problem of child homelessness is just, it's horrific in this country right now. So I think that there are it sets it sets a cultural stage for those of us in activism who do this work. So it's not necessarily an activist platform. And then take a look at these three. Passing Stranger, just released. It's a walking tour of East Village. It's a poetry walking tour, so it's sort of, again, it's a cultural intervention. It's really amazing. Malnutrition Worldwide is from Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. That was sort of a direct action. That was it was an installation in the real world that was traveled cities, with video, image, a website that asked for people to do just one thing, to sign a petition to the World Health Organization. So it was the action was actually very simple. And the last thing is McKinsey. McKinsey's starting to get into storytelling. I know, it's starting to get into storytelling. Yeah. But so they're looking at entrepreneurship without boundaries. They didn't say borders, but they said boundaries. And these are stories of people. So, you know, it's almost like following in the footsteps of Acumen to a certain extent. You all know Acumen. But these are sort of stories from the ground. So let's talk really quickly about funding, like who's paying for this stuff. Funding is a challenge. You know, it is a huge challenge right now. There are very few funders. There are sort of many ways to do it, but it is not easy. You have to be a ninja to finance this kind of work. So you're sort of looking at these kind of like corporate sponsorship, crowdsource. People are trying to get audience funding and audience production. Like people are actually trying to get people to volunteer and help out on some of these platforms. Philanthropic funding, of course. And then people are thinking about income revenue models, which is still not a whole lot going on there. And then if you have a technology piece to what you do, you can sort of look for venture capital or private equity, which people are increasingly starting to do if they can create a technology or a company out of their narrative platforms. If you want to know more about funding in particular, take a look at Tribeca Film Institute's Sandbox. There's also a video, a couple of videos. One is from Jeff Gomez and one is from me about sort of process. And by the way, I'm not talking too much about process or workflow tonight. I have a couple of videos on YouTube that talk very deeply about process, about how I construct things. And there are a bunch of sort of slide decks that talk about process and SlideShare. But again, we can talk a little bit about that. We can talk about a lot, Cheryl. Like, all in the Q&A. And then just thinking about business models, about how people are trying to construct these narrative platforms for social change. I mean, some of them are for-profit companies, rarely. Most of them are nonprofit organizations who are either commissioning or funding or creating. Story Worlds is, what I talked about, this sort of the notion of putting together any kind of, if you're an independent media person, you can start thinking, or if you're a marketing firm, if you're an advertising firm, you'll have the resources to put together a whole range of assets around one story. So think about things like The Matrix as a story world, right? Or any of the Marvel, DC comics. That's all story worlds. And then campaigns and projects, which are basically coming from nonprofits. There are market opportunities for anybody who wants to get into this, even though funding is still really difficult. People who aren't using narrative design too much yet, but hopefully soon, corporate social responsibility. I see that very little. Right? So CSR departments and community engagement departments of corporations not using narrative design so much yet. And advertising marketing, they're using narrative design, but not for social impact just yet. Right? So there's a huge opportunity there. And then management consulting, right? So McKinsey's starting to get into it. But I haven't seen it from like Dahlberg or BCG or any of these other ones. So there is opportunity for anybody who works in that realm to start doing it. And then, because I am an attorney, I have to talk about challenges. I can't talk about just the positives. Okay, so we'll just talk about a couple of these things, right? There's a number of challenges when it comes to putting together narrative platforms for social change, or narrative platforms in general. One, obviously, is intellectual property concerns. Number two is a gulf between theory, critique, and practice. There are a number of platforms now that serve as proofs of concept, but we still don't have enough. Right? We still can't really prove that these platforms actually cause change. Right? they actually result in. A love of the platform and technology. We are still designing narrative platforms from technology and not from local story, or not from human need. We're still thinking about, well, where's your iPad app? I mean, still, I know it's shifting, but we're still thinking about it. Right? So that's one. Another one is hijacking narrative. Right? So when I talk about narrative power, like back to that first slide, the whole notion that people, especially people in the developing world or in disadvantaged communities, a lot of times we go in and we take their stories and we use them for marketing, we use them for fundraising, we use them for, our Christmas things. This is hijacking narrative. One of the reasons that I think about the power of narrative is because I want to talk about the narrative power of local communities. And we don't talk about that enough. And then, of course, funding and distribution and impact measurement. Impact measurement is a huge challenge. There's a lot of activity in the philanthropic and institutional world about how we measure the impact of things. It's still really focused on media impressions, not necessarily impact on the ground. And we can talk about that as well, but there are huge challenges. My sort of thought on some of these challenges lies in intentionality, right? What is our intention in creating these things? Like, how do you start creating rigor around these platforms? So not running around hijacking narrative or just, creating, and this is true not just of narrative platforms, it's also true of any DIY, social enterprise kind of thing. There is a huge problem in narrative platforms and storytelling in terms of the fine lines between story, engagement, and propaganda. It's really easy to flip into that. It's really easy to flip into propaganda if you don't sort of follow your intentionality. And then it's the bridging the engagement to action gap. So I do believe that setting the cultural stage and sort of aiming at shifts in perception is social change, but we often still get stuck, right, in raising awareness and just sort of causing that shift in perception. The notion of creating it and investing in these platforms and then not going to action, I think is still a problem. I look for community-centered participation, a move beyond awareness, and platforms that are culturally appropriate, right? So when it comes to intentionality. And then I have an assessment model that you can get on SlideShare. Like it's an actual assessment platform for your narrative platforms when you put them together. And you can when you take this, you can just click on the SlideShare. And then the final thing is I've co-founded a project called Regarding Humanity to deal with the notion of hijacking narrative and narrative power and ethics and effective storytelling called Regarding Humanity. So it's a bunch of us in aid, development, social innovation, and media who've come together to sort of think about what are good uses of narrative and design and what are not so good uses, and we're sort of discussing that through a number of different salons and discussion posts and blogs and things like that. So look for that. And that's it for the moment.
So I'm sad to say that we actually can't talk about all the things that Lina said
I
we
know,
can talk
sorry.
about. But I'm only going to ask a few questions and then we'll open it up to everyone. And coincidentally, Lina was the first person 2 years before the program opened that I said, will you teach? So she was also the first person I spoke to. And she said, if I'm still living in New York, absolutely. So
And I still am?
you still are, yeah. So you mentioned narrative power several times, and you've talked about this, but someone came to the program recently and gave us a definition for social change, which is the redistribution of wealth and power, which I love because it's simple, and I also love because it includes the seriousness of it. So, and Lina and I get together and rail against what we call social innovation light,
Yeah.
right? Which is people who don't know enough to know what they're doing or think that it happens quickly. So for people who want to get into this area, how do you know that you're working at a deep and thoughtful level? You've got years of experience doing this, but for someone who's getting involved, how do you know? How do you know when you're doing it in a sensitive and thoughtful way.
So, one of the things is time, right? It really is the notion of time. One of the problems with people who are constructing narrative platforms, documentaries, social enterprises is the notion of helicoptering in. And this happens very often, like when people just go in and say, oh, we're gonna do this. This happened in Haiti all the time, right? I mean, I know so many people who went in and just, oh, we're gonna do this. Oops. Oh, sorry. Do y'all need this? No.
No.
Right? No. We'll just look at, is that you, Eli? It's pretty cute. Let's leave it up. So one is, sort of is a notion of time. It's a notion of learning and understanding and putting in that time and it's almost like the notion of an apprenticeship. Like before I was an attorney, and before I became the executive director of something, I did two things. I apprenticed myself to Michaela Walsh, who started Women's World Banking. She was a microfinance person. And then I went and got a certificate on nonprofit management, things like that. So I felt like I had to put in some time to really understand process.
We could have handled that. Just
Thank you. It's nice to see you though. So that's number one. Number two is really a handle on the communities that you're working in. Right, whether you yourself, I'm not the kind of person who believes that you need to be of the community to really understand it. Like there are a number of people who say people from the West should never go into the developing world. I disagree with that, right? Because I do think that there is a notion of objective voice. It's how you approach something, it's how you think about power, right? And how much power you're willing to cede, in terms of framing narrative, because framing narrative is a political act, right? So that sort of, those are the things that I'm looking for, like whether you are able to go into a community, understand it, spend time there, really understand what a community needs, and then be able to work in a partnership and not in a positional way.
great. As this whole area becomes more popular, people discover it, I assume we are more likely to see big productions and more celebrities. You use probably the handsomest celebrity on. But what's your point of view on, I guess number one, the thing that happens when everybody begins to think it's cool, and number two, the role that celebrities play in this?
Sure. I mean, Gael is the handsomest for sure, but he also does his homework, right? So he's been an activist as long as he's been an actor, and as long as he's been a celebrity. So that's one of the things that I find. I've worked with celebrities before who didn't know what they were doing at all. And that's painful, right? It's a painful, especially when they're helicoptering in. Like I remember working with my first executive directorship was made up of a sort of a post-Hollywood board, and one of the people wanted to sort of bring her children in to show them how lucky they were to not be in this situation. I mean, that's not just celebrity. That's anybody who helicopters in or sort of comes in without the right intention. But I think, the role of celebrity, I'll answer the second thing first, the role of celebrity in this could be really beneficial in a lot of ways, because what celebrities can do is shine a much bigger light than we sort of civilians can in a lot of ways, because they can show that. But the smartest celebrities know when to get out of the way, or know what they can do and what they can't do, or do their homework, right, and really understand. Like again, in the case of Gael, he is of the community. He's part of that community, and he can sort of, walk that journey and take that journey because he is from there. But he's also done his work. He's sort of invested back in Mexico, invested back in Latin America, things like that. So I think he is an asset in a lot of ways, but even beyond his celebrity. And in terms of getting bigger, I think we in the sort of transmedia narrative design community are trying to go smaller, right? Because the problem with sort of big budgets and big productions is that they don't always work, they don't always work in favor of social change. They work in favor in terms of awareness, right? So if your whole notion is you want to raise awareness, that's fine, but there's not enough time and there's not enough money to spread around to actually get to the call to action then. right? So when I look at these massive productions, these massive kind of transmedia platforms, I'm a little turned off, honestly. So I'm looking at like smaller budgets. Yes, a little bit, yeah. I'm not going to name names just right now, but there are some really big ones out there that are, get a lot of attention, and yet when you look at the impact doesn't justify the investment.
And what's the price of that for the field?
Well, it depends. We're at such a big initial point. Like when I say things like that, I do get pushback because don't criticize the big platforms because we want people to be, excited about the possibilities of these platforms, right? And so the criticism against me is that I'm sort of producing a chilling effect against to funders or participants who don't really understand how to create social change in the first place, and they want to invest in these platforms. So I understand that. I do understand that argument. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I understand it. The price is that people get burned out, right? Like when they start digging down and you see these sort of like $5, $10, $15 million projects, and the ultimate impact is a lot of people know about the project. People aren't necessarily, funders who are interested in impact are going to turn away. So I'm much more interested in those smaller projects that can actually demonstrate impact.
I was struck by what you said about Diana Cristal. You said some of the comments were really dismaying.
Yeah.
So, is it to be expected that when you engage in campaigns like this, that you make as many people angry, or can you talk about some of the different kinds of response that are sort of necessary if you're going to change people's minds?
Sure. I mean, when you're working at any kind of human rights or social impact, global development thing, you're going to come up against people who don't agree with what you're doing, particularly on something like migration, right? Or, what people term illegal immigration. And when you look at, do go to Bodies on the Border or to the Upworthy site, and you can look at some of the comments. I mean, people are like, why would we care that they were illegal anyway, quote unquote? Who cares if they're dying? Why should we care about this? Why should we pay for their identification? So those kinds of comments are like, you expect them, but even when you read them, they hurt, right? So there's that. You're like, you want people to understand the inherent dignity, inherent worth of a human life. And then when people sort of say, oh, they were breaking the law, they should die, you're like, whoa, it's just like, it pushes you back. But that's where change happens, right? So you want people to be able to express that. You want people to say, no, look at this. And then you can you put all of your arguments against that. Like, you need that feedback, for sure.
I have one last question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. The remarkable fact that you allow people to hear the voices that are never heard comes with big responsibility. Can you talk about, it's another one of those how do you know questions, but the ethics of that, right? The ethics of making things public, and the impact that the storytelling has. How, again, for someone who's becoming interested in this field, is this some internal guide that you have, or?
No, there's obviously there's an instinct to it, but no, there are codes of ethics that have been written, right? So the codes of ethics that you can sort of access, I can send them to you. There's also an ethical framework that I've written, right, that is part of the Regarding Humanity thing, because it's extremely, as I keep saying, it's extremely important to acknowledge the role of narrative power in social change and setting the stage for change. It can't just be financial, it can't just be political, it has to be, we have to understand that sometimes local communities and disadvantaged communities, all they have is their story, right? That is their intellectual property, and they're bringing that to the table, and that's their asset, right? So we have to understand that. At the same time, especially in in the context of genocide or something, that you have to be extremely important about identity and privacy and security. So you have to be very careful. The nonprofit Witness does a beautiful job of protecting that, and they have a number of resources. In terms of on the other side, like on consumer platforms or like in advertising, you have to make sure you have adequate permissions in place. You can't commodify people's stories without understanding who's going to be benefiting from that. You always have to ask, who's benefiting from this, right? Who's gaining the profit, whether that's the social impact bottom line or a financial bottom line. Who's benefiting? Right? You have to ask that question every single time. So it is using people's stories and framing their stories. Like I said, it's a political act. It's an act of power, and you have to work with the community directly, always making sure that they understand how they're being represented.
And potentially what the unintended consequences might be for them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sometimes telling your story is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've worked, in communities where the amount of fame that people get, they're not prepared for it, or that their stories being disclosed to like family members, and they didn't really, understand that, or the future psychological trauma, right, of having your story being told. There's a responsibility in that, but you have to, especially when you work with children, you have to be really careful.
Great. Shall we purge and take questions?
Sure.
I don't know how much time we have left, but we'll answer questions from anyone. Yes, Deb.
Hi. I'm interested in what the entry points are, and maybe where entrepreneurship fits in.
Sure, like entry points into a...
Because people are starting to enter this field.
So not narrative entry points, but... Oh, okay. There are so many. So, again, given that... Oh, sorry. Do you want to use... Oh, it doesn't. Oh, so the question is, what are the entry points into the field of narrative design or transmedia design? Like, how can people who want to get into the field get into it? Again, given that funding is still really difficult, a lot of people come into it as volunteers or as people who are not necessarily making a whole lot of money, or they're doing it on the side. This is a huge problem, right? Because there's a huge responsibility with crafting narrative platforms for social impact. So that's a problem. But you can come in as a media creator, you can come in as a filmmaker or a documentary filmmaker, you can come in as a coder, you can come in as a designer, whether that's process design, product design, service design, any of those things. You can come in as a strategist, which is pretty much how I come in, right? Looking at how you create these things. You can come in as a producer, you can come in as a funder, you can come in as an investor, whether it's in the technology again or investor in the actual media. You can come in as a journalist. So there are many, many ways to come in. Probably if you're a dentist, not so much, but I think anything else you can come in.
Hi. You talked briefly about the theory of change of call to action not being as clear, as powerful in larger projects, and it being sort of better articulated in smaller projects. I'd love to hear a little bit more about why that is, or how a smaller project better articulates the theory of change or draws users more directly into those points of action.
Sure, so the question was, you want me to articulate why I think bigger projects don't articulate a call to action or measure impact as well, or less successful in doing that. So I don't believe that larger projects can't articulate a call to action. My point is that to date, the larger projects haven't. Doesn't mean that they can't. And I think that a larger networked, a larger top-down project isn't necessarily ever going to articulate a call to action that is community-based. A networked response, right, where you're working again directly with the community, something like, almost like an Organizing for America kind of notion, not that that's a narrative platform. But if you were able to do that sort of massive, global or national, that's networked and there are different nodes of responsibility, you can still do that. I'm not saying that big projects can't, I'm saying big projects haven't to date. And not that smaller projects have either. I mean, there are projects where there is a clear, sort of change. I would encourage you to take a look at BritDoc's work in this. They've been looking at project, documentary films and other projects that have a clear sort of path to impact, like The Act of Killing. If anybody's seen The Act of Killing, that documentary, it's not a narrative platform, it's not a design, sort of a transmedia platform, but there is a clear path from the narrative to impact, and you can map it. It's pretty amazing. But I think that until we dig deeper into how you map narrative to impact, I particularly, because I understand sort of the funding and what goes into crafting these platforms, I want to see smaller investments and deeper impact, not large investments and shallow impact. Right? I think we can go bigger if we crack that nut. Does that answer your question?
I'm glad you mentioned the act of killing. I'd love it for some of the campaigns that you mentioned. Could you just quickly talk about where you have seen impact? You talk about how hard it is to craft these things and sometimes even measure impact.
Yeah.
And I'm also interested in the impact, the best impact examples you've seen was that really thoughtfully designed from the beginning, or were there some unexpected outcomes that are traceable to the storytelling?
Okay, so let me see if I can repeat that. Which projects that I mentioned have I seen impact, and was the impact sort of baked in from the beginning? And then what was the second part of the question? Okay, that's good. So I've seen a number of projects where you can demonstrate impact. Act of Killing is certainly one. Bully is a transmedia project that you can demonstrate a clear sense of impact and a clear sense of community, right? Like that project. Do you know Bully? Bully is a documentary film and a social media, transmedia engagement platform around the issue of increase in bullying in schools in America. So the documentary film and the documentary filmmaker Lee Hirsch, who's like this one-man impact engine, basically created this entire initiative to build community around accountability and reduction of bullying. So you can just sort of see the impact, and they create multiple entry points into their work, right, into their assets. With something like our work on Born into Brothels, I mean, I guess there's clear impact with the individual kids in the film, and also sort of looking at the different countries that we had gone into and the investment back into the community with this sort of school and home, and there's still continuity with that project. With Who is Danny Cristel, I mean, we baked in, it's sort of been this unique luxury almost of tying the social impact and perception shift and education portions directly alongside the production. And we've already, even though the film's not yet been released theatrically, we have direct impact. We've sort of managed to raise some funds for the community that's in the film itself to build its own water access system because they didn't have access to clean water throughout the day. So things like that, that's direct service, right? That's almost like a development concept. And then with nonprofits, right? I mean, that's a different kind of impact metric, but using narrative has increased the number of co-creation capacity, things like that. So yes, I can, and I have stuff at home that I can send you if you want to look at impact metrics. But it's not easy. Measuring impact is not easy, and one of the problems that we've got is that people want to measure impact in a very short-term way. It's almost like this hedge fund kind of way of, show me your impact quarterly. But who can measure social change quarterly, right? So that's a problem, and that's how we're tying, media to that, where media is short-term. It creates a moment in time, and you're looking at media impressions. How do you understand that your film is the thing that made somebody change? Like when I see the comment on the op doc saying, "Never thought of it that way, I'm going to change my vote." There you go, right? I mean, you can sort of see that, but how often does that happen, right? You can also take a look at the Invisible War, about just rape in the military. You can sort of trace that directly to legislative action. So, yeah.
You talked earlier about narrative design and engaging many people in the story.
Oh yeah, that slide, right? Okay. Yeah. So.
What approaches do you use to create a cohesive narrative when
Okay, so the question is, talking about building a community using cohesive narrative, how do you build a cohesive narrative in the first place? So one slide that I didn't show you is like my strategic planning framework, which I've sort of reframed. Do you guys know do you know Alex Osterwalder? So Alex Osterwalder created the business model canvas, business model design canvas, right? Right, so I took his master class and then took his canvas with his permission and sort of retrofitted my framework into his stuff. And question number one that I always ask is, what are we trying to change? Like, it is the action goals, the call to action that comes first for me. And then you go through everything else, and then you say, what is the narrative around that? And everything that we do in terms of media creation has to adhere to that narrative and that change. Right, so that's how you create and it always has to go, like there's a core question that's articulated for any particular part of the social action. And the core question leads to the narrative, right? And then we almost write it out like a treatment, like a film treatment. Like, this is the narrative that everything has to go back to that core narrative. I think they can, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think Participant is a particularly interesting business model because it's unique in the field, right? So Participant Productions is Jeff Skoll's for-profit company that it's not just it's documentary and narrative film, right? And TV, yeah. They just launched their TV network in September, I think. Aimed at sort of creating a cultural conversation or social change, social impact around the film property. And when you look at something that they did with like Inconvenient Truth, like that was really pretty interesting. And they've done some really work that they worked on a zombie film, a zombie horror film, and actually tied an action component to that was really successful, strangely enough. That was their biggest profit maker. And then they've had some misses as well, right? Like we all do, right? We all have failures, right? But like The Beaver, The Beaver, which was Mel Gibson's film. Jodie Foster made a film with Mel Gibson. I don't know what their relationship is, I can't get it. But he, he played a mentally challenged man who can only relate to the world through a beaver puppet. It was like really bizarre. And they invested, they invested in this and like made it about, mentally challenged people, and that was not exactly the way I would have gone. But I think that the business model is really interesting. So yeah. But there are a number of companies. So Participant is one, and then you have Mirada is a new company. Guillermo del Toro, who's the film director, who's also done some horror. He created an entire transmedia production firm. They haven't done a lot of social impact work, but that's sort of the world's first transmedia design firm. Right, so there's that. And then, IDEO and Frog are trying to get into narrative design a little bit. So it's starting to bubble. But I think larger companies can do this. That's why I said I think there's a market opportunity here for larger companies to invest in this. Anybody else?
Last call for a question?
Just a quick question on price tags for campaigns like this. What's the range for a small focus campaign?
So the question is, what are price tags on this? It really depends on how many assets you want, whether you want, like when you're working with a full-length documentary, which I don't advise doing most of the time, because those are huge price tags and distribution is a really big problem. Then the price shoots up. If you're looking to do sort of a more like a web documentary, again, it depends on how many people. One of the things I can't figure out to a certain extent is certain budgets, because a lot of work is still being done in sort of unpaid man hours. And this skews budgets. right? So there's someone back there named Marissa John who's an amazing transmedia designer, and she can talk about this as well. She's right back there in the blue sweater. So make sure you talk to her. Her platforms are fantastic. It ranges anywhere from, you could probably get one done for like anywhere from like 10 to 20,000 if you just wanted to put up a very simple website with, just some videos or some data visualizations, things like that, all the way to like $15 million for half the sky, right? So the budgets, it depends on how many people you're employing, how many assets you're creating, how many partnerships you're, putting together. A lot of the money, I think with Half the Sky, was partnership, sort of cultivation. There's no price tag. It depends. You have to cost it out depending on, again, what you want to change. If you're just doing a simple petition, I'm not a petition person, but if that's what you're doing, then it's going to cost, a certain price. If you're trying to create like a national dialogue, then it's going to cost something. It just depends. But there are fixed costs of like coders and website design. Like those they're slightly fixed costs, but you can never say, well, this will cost this.
Any more questions?
Go ahead, Sharon.
Yeah. So when a project involves having a conversation online and trying to create a space for deeper conversation, especially among strangers or anonymous people who might be writing some dismaying comments, have you seen any cool tools or platforms where that actually kind of happens and happens well online?
Yeah. So there are two. One is GMD Studios, which is run by Brian Clark in New York City, has a discussion. It's called the Civil Discussion Technology, I think it's called, but it's called America on Blank. And it's a technology that they developed in 1999 that was sort of offline, and they just brought it online. Their first civil dialogue is going to be about guns in January, gun control. So that's one methodology. And then there's another methodology called deliberative polling that comes out of the Center for the Greater Good. So they're trying to look at, again, sort of this notion of bringing in local storytelling, bringing in local voice, but creating a more sort of civil and engaged dialogue among strangers, among lay people, right? So those are two that I know of. But they're not going to fix the YouTube problem. No. Sorry, did you all hear his question, by the way? Okay. Any other question? Yeah, go ahead.
First I want to say thank you for sharing, for your talk. Just talking about transmedia, using narrative through documentaries and movies. There's also people, in the past have used narratives through their music, through songs, through dance, which affect the human experience in different ways. Do you believe that's a strong platform on its own as an entry level for artists to actually speak narratives that can help you understand situations through music? Is that alive on its own, do you believe? Or
absolutely, yeah. So the question is, I've been talking a lot about transmedia with film or transmedia with documentary or journalism, and whether I believe that music or dance or sort of the non-visual, I guess, right?
Dance is visual, I believe.
Dance is visual, yeah. So the non-film, I guess, art forms can also be powerful entry points into a discussion about change or social impact, and absolutely. I've worked with choreographers, I've worked with a dancer, I've worked with, so the Haiti platform, La Musique, that I sort of mentioned in passing, that there's no film component to that, there's a trailer, but that's all music, right? That's a music, and that's looking at how Haitian musicians themselves, who either are famous in their own right or up and coming, can gain access to a greater global audience, right, for their music. And sort of contribute back to the creative economy and a more flourishing economy in Haiti. That's all music. And I think that musicians, and to go back to Deb's question about entry points or people coming in, musicians, any kind of artist, musicians, painters, photographers, anybody can sort of come into this and marry their work with other artists, other media creators, other technologists, and other designers, and create these very vibrant platforms. So for example, with Who is Danny Cristal, and we're not doing dance, that'd be kind of cool, but we're going to be working with a visual artist and street artists to sort of, to create another entry point, another kind of discussion into the issue of migration. I would like to work with more dancers. That's sort of more my dream, so yeah.
I've gotten the signal that we should run.
Okay.
Lina, thank you for being so generous with your time.
Thank you.
Your knowledge. Thank you all for coming.